Colorado mountains, late December 1881. The wind came down like a blade, slicing through pine and timber as snow twisted violently across the ridge. Nathaniel Briggs stood on the front porch of his secluded cabin, shoulders hunched. Under a worn wool coat, eyes narrowed against the flurry. He had lived alone up here for 3 winters now, since burying his wife Sarah and their infant son beneath the aspens down the slope. The silence suited him. No neighbors meant no questions about why he never came to town social gatherings, why he paid for supplies with silver coins instead of credit, why his eyes went dark whenever someone mentioned family. The letter had arrived. A week ago, folded in oilskin and carried up the mountain by a traveling merchant who complained the whole way about the treacherous climb. The ink was faded but legible. A suitable domestic companion has been arranged per your request. She is to arrive within the month, weather permitting. Cooking, cleaning, and basic homestead duties expected. Payment received in advance. No returns after arrival. Nathaniel had crumpled the letter, then smoothed it out again. He had not asked for beauty or charm in his correspondence with the Denver placement agency. Just someone capable, quiet, and strong-handed enough to make it through a Colorado winter without going mad from isolation. He had not expected her to arrive mid-blizzard, and certainly not like this. Through the curtain of snow, he spotted a figure staggering up the ridge with a canvas satchel over one shoulder and another bundle clutched tight to her chest. When she drew close enough for him to make out her face, Nathaniel's brow furrowed deeply. Her belly was unmistakably round beneath her threadbare cloak, swollen with child despite the brutal cold and treacherous journey. She climbed the porch steps slowly, each breath visible in puffs of white against the freezing air. Snow clung to her cloak and boots, melting in small rivers down the worn fabric, but her eyes, dark brown and unreadable, stayed fixed on his face with a steady determination that surprised him. "If you want a refund, you'll have to wait until spring," she said, voice steady despite the obvious tremor in her hands from cold and exhaustion. "I ain't walking back through that storm." Nathaniel's jaw tightened as he stared at her belly, then back at her wind-burned face. The agency had said nothing about this condition, nothing about the complications it would bring to an already isolated existence. "I didn't pay for a child," he said evenly, his words cutting through the howling wind. "I didn't ask you to," she replied without flinching. "But he's coming either way, and I need shelter till spring thaw makes travel possible again." The wind howled between them, rattling the cabin shutters and sending snow spiraling across the porch. She did not step back, did not beg or plead, just stood there with quiet dignity despite her obvious vulnerability. For a long moment, Nathaniel said nothing, stunning this unexpected complication to his carefully ordered solitude. Then, without a word, he reached for her satchel and lifted it off her shoulder with surprising gentleness. He stepped back inside, holding the door open. She hesitated for just a heartbeat, then followed. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke, venison stew long, since simmered down, and the particular mustiness of a place where only one person had breathed for too long. The main room held a narrow bed pushed against one wall, a pine table scarred from years of use, and shelves lined with mason jars, hand tools, and books that looked untouched since Sarah died. A stone hearth dominated the far wall, its embers glowing faintly in the gathering darkness. Nathaniel placed her satchel near the fireplace, then moved to the wood box without looking at her. He selected a thick log and dropped it into the stove with more force than necessary. Flames caught slowly, casting flickering light on the rough-hewn walls and illuminating the woman more clearly. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps 25, with sharp cheekbones and a mouth that seemed more familiar with silence than smiles. Her hair, dark brown and pulled back severely, had worked loose from its pins during the journey, giving her a wild, untamed appearance, despite her obvious attempt at propriety. "Supper's ready when you are," he said finally, stirring the pot of stew that had been simmering most of the day. "You rest till then." Anna, for that was the name written on the letter, did not thank him. She simply nodded, removed her snow-crusted cloak with slow, stiff fingers, and stepped closer to the fire. Nathaniel watched from the corner of his eye as she reached one hand toward the warmth, while the other rested protectively on her swollen belly. Her dress was patched in several places, carefully mended, but showing the wear of someone who made do with what she had. He walked past her, pulled a folded blanket from the chair by the window, and tossed it toward the narrow cot against the far wall. "The bed's yours," he muttered, already missing the solitude of his usual evening routine. She nodded again, lowering herself onto the edge of the bed with a barely concealed wince. The journey up the mountain had clearly taken its toll, but she made no complaint, asked for no special consideration. Nathaniel found himself grudgingly respectful of her stoicism, even as he resented the disruption to his carefully maintained isolation. He crossed to the pantry, ladled stew into 2 bowls, and set them on the table, along with thick slices of bread he had baked that morning. Outside, the wind screamed like a banshee through the pines, but inside, 2 strangers sat in the brittle quiet of an arrangement neither had fully anticipated. Anna ate slowly, methodically, as if each bite required careful consideration. She kept her eyes on her bowl, but Nathaniel could feel her taking in every detail of the cabin, the dust motes dancing in the lamplight, the photographs turned face down on the mantel, the rocking chair by the window that had not been used since Sarah died. She asked no questions, made no attempts at conversation, and somehow that made her presence both less intrusive and more unsettling. After supper, she helped clear the table without being asked, moving carefully but efficiently despite her condition. When she finally retreated to the bed, Nathaniel settled into his usual chair by the fire with a book he had been pretending to read for weeks. The familiar routine felt strange with another person breathing in the same small space, their separate silences somehow more profound than his solitude had ever been. The days moved slowly through January, each one bleeding into the next in shades of white and gray. Snow clung to the cabin's eaves like a second roof, and the wind never stopped its restless conversation with the pines. Inside, Anna worked without complaint or instruction, as if she had lived in the cabin for years instead of weeks. She swept the wooden floors each morning, chopped vegetables for stew with steady precision, and boiled linens in the back room that Nathaniel had cleared out for her use. Her steps were careful but unhesitating, even as her belly grew heavier with each passing day. She never asked for help carrying water from the well or lifting the heavy iron pot from the stove. Never mentioned the backaches that Nathaniel could see in the way she pressed her hand to her spine when she thought he was not watching. Never said a word about the morning sickness that sometimes sent her rushing outside into the bitter cold. Nathaniel observed her in stolen glances over his morning coffee cup, through the frost-covered window while he tended the horses in the amber glow of lamplight during their silent suppers. She moved through her tasks with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned early that survival depended on usefulness, that earning her keep was the only security she could count on. She had taken the small back room without fuss keeping it neat as a pin, though she brought almost nothing personal into it. No photographs, no keepsakes, no feminine touches, only a bundle of carefully mended clothes and a well-worn Bible that she never read aloud. The room remained as impersonal as a hotel, as if she was prepared to leave at a moment's notice. They spoke rarely, and when they did, it was about practical matters. "Do you want potatoes or cornbread with supper?" She might ask, and he would grunt, "Either's fine." Sometimes he would mention, "Chickens are laying light," and she would nod and adjust the feed without another word. It was a cold peace, but peace nonetheless. built on mutual respect for boundaries and an unspoken agreement not to pry into each other's carefully guarded histories. The rhythm might have continued unchanged through the winter, but one night, in the deep silence between the logs shifting in the stove and the creak of settling rafters, Nathaniel heard a muffled sob, barely more than a breath. He paused, axe still in hand mid-split beside the hearth, and listened. The sound came again from behind her closed door. Just one cry, broken and raw, like something escaping against its will. He did not knock or call out. Instead, he stepped quietly to the hallway, fed 2 more logs into the wood stove just outside her door, and placed a tin cup of warm water on the floor where she would find it. Then he returned to his chair and sat motionless until dawn, listening to the wind and thinking about the different kinds of grief that could drive woman to accept work in the wilderness. When Anna emerged the next morning, the fire was burning strong and warm. The cup sat empty beside her door, but what stopped her breath was the shawl, her thick woolen wrap, stained from the road in weeks of cooking grease, now clean and folded neatly at the foot of her bed. She found him in the kitchen already, tending the morning fire with his back to her. Anna stood in the doorway for a long moment, the clean shawl draped over her arm, watching the careful way he fed kindling to the flames. There was something different in his movements today, less rigid, though she could not quite name what had changed. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, her voice still rough with sleep and something deeper. He did not turn around, just continued adjusting the damper on the stove. "Wasn't being kind," he said after a pause, as if kindness were something to be guarded against. "Just decent. There's a difference." Anna studied the line of his shoulders, the way his hands moved with practiced efficiency over tasks that had once belonged to another woman. She nodded once and moved to the stove to begin breakfast, but something had shifted in the careful distance they had maintained. A crack in the wall, small but undeniable. That evening, when she went to her room, she found something else waiting, a book, old and leather-bound, its spine cracked but pages clean. It was a medical manual, the kind frontier doctors carried when they rode circuits between distant towns. Inside, a torn scrap of paper marked a chapter halfway through: birth preparation, positioning, risks, and midwife alternatives. Anna stood by the narrow bed for a long time, holding the book against her chest. The pages were yellowed, but the information was clear, thorough, written for people who might have to manage without professional help. She understood what it meant, that he had been thinking ahead, preparing for what was coming, whether he welcomed it or not. She did not knock on his door to thank him, did not interrupt his evening routine with expressions of gratitude that might embarrass them both. But when she brought him his supper that night, she placed the bowl gently on the table instead of setting it down with her usual efficiency. And for the first time since arriving, she sat across from him instead of taking her meal standing by the stove. Neither spoke during the meal, but they ate together while the wind moaned against the shutters. In that shared silence, something invisible began to shift, like a frost line breaking deep underground, making way for whatever might grow when spring finally came. The snow had begun its slow retreat, if only by inches. Mud tracked in through the front steps each morning, and Anna wiped it away without complaint, understanding that this was simply another rhythm of mountain life. Her hands had grown steadier with the passing weeks, her steps more confident despite the increasing awkwardness of her condition. She still took her meals quietly, but sometimes now her eyes would meet his across the table, and neither would look away as quickly as before. One evening, as wind rattled the window panes and sent snow spiraling past in ghostly sheets, Anna lingered by the stove after finishing the supper dishes. Nathaniel sat in his usual spot by the hearth, whittling kindling with slow, precise strokes that had become as familiar as breathing. The knife moved rhythmically through the pine, sending thin curls of wood spiraling to the floor. She sat down across from him, hands folded carefully in her lap, and for several minutes neither spoke. The fire crackled and hissed, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, while outside the storm continued its relentless assault on the mountain. "My husband died in a work camp," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel's hands stilled, knife frozen mid-stroke. He did not look up immediately, understanding instinctively that this was not a story that could bear the weight of direct attention. Instead, he waited, giving her the space to continue or retreat as she chose. "It wasn't the war," Anna went on, her voice growing steadier. "He was taken over nothing. They said he stole a sack of flour from the camp stores. We both knew that was a lie. He was trying to stop one of the guards from putting his hands on me." Nathaniel set the knife aside. Carefully, his jaw tightening at implications he understood without needing details. He had seen enough of the world to know how power worked in places where no one was watching. He hit the man once, just one punch when the guard wouldn't listen to reason. They dragged him off that very night. Anna's voice trembled, but did not break, each word deliberate and clear. "Next morning, they told me he died from internal bleeding. Said his ribs were broken in the struggle. They never let me see him. Just handed me his wedding ring wrapped in a piece of newspaper." Nathaniel stood slowly and moved to the shelf where he kept his few dishes. He poured water from the pitcher into a tin cup and returned to offer it to her. Anna took it with both hands, grateful for something to hold, something warm and real to anchor her to the present moment. "I ain't told that story to anyone," she whispered, staring down into the cup. "But it follows me everywhere, even here." For a long while, the only sound was the crackle of pine logs in the hearth and the wind's endless conversation with the mountain. Nathaniel returned to his chair and stared into the flames, turning over her words, understanding now why she had accepted work so far from civilization, why she carried herself like someone always ready to flee. "Those kinds of stories got claws," he said finally. "They don't let go easy. But out here, at least, they can't follow us fast." She smiled then, faint but genuine, grateful for his simple acceptance of her truth without judgment or false comfort. They sat together as the fire burned low, two people who had learned that survival sometimes meant carrying unbearable things, alone until you found someone strong enough to help bear the weight. Days passed, and with them came the traveling merchant, who made monthly rounds through the scattered homesteads and mining camps. While Nathaniel bartered for coffee, sugar, and lamp oil, the man's eyes kept drifting to Anna where she waited by the wagon, holding a list of household needs. "That the widow from Kansas?" the merchant asked quietly, glancing around to make sure she could not hear. "The one whose man got killed in the work camp? Heard tell she just disappeared one day." By the next morning, whispers had begun to follow, them like smoke. Nathaniel noticed it first in the general store, where conversation stopped when he entered and resumed in hushed tones after he passed. Anna felt it too, in the way people's eyes lingered on her belly, in the speculative looks and careful distances that marked her. As someone whose story was not quite respectable, when Nathaniel stepped into the saloon that evening, he did so with his shoulders square and his hat pushed back from his brow, making sure every man present could see his face clearly. "She works for me," he said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "She's under my roof and my protection. Anyone who has a problem with that arrangement can bring it directly to me." No one answered. No one needed to. The message was clear, and Nathaniel's reputation as a man who kept his word and his Winchester was well established in these mountains. That night, Nathaniel saddled Anaz Mara with extra care, adjusting the stirrups and wrapping the saddle in a thick wool blanket that had once belonged to his mother. she had kept folded in a cedar chest at the foot of her marriage bed. The blanket was soft from years of careful storage, woven in a pattern of blue and white that caught the moonlight like scattered stars. When Anna came out to help with the evening feeding, she noticed the extra padding and raised a questioning eyebrow. The Mari stood patiently, her breath visible in small white puffs in the cold air. "You'll be riding out tomorrow," Nathaniel said, without looking up from checking the girth. "Best the ride be a comfortable one." Anna moved closer, running her hand along the edge of the wool blanket. The pattern was intricate, clearly made by skilled hands with love and patience. "You didn't have to use something so fine." "I know," he said simply, leading the Mari back to the shelter of the lean-to. "But it's been folded away too long. Better it gets used for something worthwhile." She touched the edge of the blanket again, understanding without words that this was more than practical consideration. It was acceptance, inclusion, a wordless statement that she belonged under his protection now. "Thank you, Nathaniel." He nodded once and turned back to the feed bags, but Anna caught the slight softening around his eyes that he could not quite hide. Over the following days, she began to notice other small changes. He lit the fire earlier in the mornings, left kindling, stacked beside her door without being asked, and kept her boots near the stove so they would be warm when she needed them. These were not grand gestures or spoken promises, but the quiet actions of a man who had begun to see her not as an unwanted complication, but as someone worthy of care. In return, Anna began leaving the lantern lit by the window when he rode to town for supplies, a small beacon to guide him home through the mountain darkness. She mended a tear in his favorite shirt without being asked, and began humming softly while she worked, not songs exactly, but the wordless melodies her mother had taught her, filling the cabin with something that sounded remarkably like contentment. Their conversations remained spare, but the silences between them had grown comfortable, filled with understanding rather than awkwardness. They had become something more than strangers sharing a roof, something not quite family, but moving steadily in that direction with each small kindness offered and accepted. Spring crept up the mountain slowly, as if testing the ground before committing to stay. The frost began to loosen its grip on the earth. Streams ran fuller with snowmelt, and the air carried hints of warmth that promised longer days ahead. But with the changing season came reminders that their isolated winter was drawing to a close, and decisions would soon need to be made about what came next. Anna's condition had grown more pronounced, her movements slower but determined. She still worked when Nathaniel would let her, chopping vegetables with careful precision, folding laundry in neat stacks, maintaining the rhythms that had carried them through the hardest months. But they both understood that change was coming, whether they were ready or not, and with it, the need to decide what their arrangement would become when the baby arrived and mountain passes opened again. The storm descended on the mountain with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. By nightfall, the shutters rattled like chattering teeth, and the chimney howled with a voice that sounded almost human in its distress. Lightning split the sky in jagged white scars, followed by thunder that rolled through the peaks like the pea. Footsteps of giants thought Anna doubled over beside the kitchen table just past midnight, her breath catching a sharp gasp that cut through the storm's noise. Nathaniel looked up from the book he had been pretending to read, instantly alert to the change in her breathing, the way her knuckles went white as she gripped the table's edge. "It's time," she whispered, her voice tight with the first real contraction. "Now?" he asked, half rising from his chair, though he already knew the answer from the look on her face. She nodded, unable to speak as another wave of pain washed over. There would be no time to fetch Clara Mertz, the midwife from town, no chance of crossing the treacherous mountain passes in weather that could kill a man before he traveled a mile. They were alone with the storm, and whatever knowledge Nathaniel had gleaned from the medical manual he had studied by lamplight for weeks. He cleared the kitchen table with one sweep of his arm, scattering salt, flour, and cooking implements to the floor. The guidebook fell open beside them, its pages fluttering in the draft from the rattling door. Nathaniel snatched it up, his hands trembling as he flipped to the section he had memorized, though the familiar words might as well have been written in a foreign language now that the moment had arrived. Anna cried out, her face pale as fresh snow, one hand clenched around the bedframe's wooden rail, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the world. The sound cut through Nathaniel like a blade, sharper than any physical pain he had ever endured. "You're going to be fine," he said, his voice rough with effort to stay calm. "You hear me? Just breathe through it." She did not scream at first, but her face twisted with pain so intense it seemed to bend reality around her. Hours blurred together in a haze of boiled water, clean cloths, and whispered encouragements that felt inadequate against the magnitude of what was happening. Nathaniel did what he could, followed the book's instructions, supported her when the contractions came, wiped sweat from her brow with shaking hands. When the final moment arrived, Anna's scream tore through the cabin like breaking thunder. "Push!" Nathaniel shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "He's almost here." Then came the silence, a silence so complete and terrible that it rang in his ears like a bell. The child emerged small and still, covered in blood and birth, fluid, frighteningly limp in Nathaniel's trembling hands. Anna slumped back against the pillows, chest heaving, eyes fluttering with exhaustion. But the baby did not cry. Panic boiled through Nathaniel's veins as he turned the infant over, patting the tiny back as the book instructed. Nothing. The little body remained still, too still, while precious seconds ticked away. His hand shook so violently he nearly dropped the child as he flipped desperately through the manual's pages. "Clear the airways," the text instructed. Without hesitation, Nathaniel bent low and pressed his mouth to the baby's face, drawing out the fluid that blocked breath and life. The taste was bitter, overwhelming, but he spat it aside and tried again. His whole world narrowed to this one desperate task. The baby jerked suddenly, then sputtered. A cry emerged weak and wavering at first, but unmistakably alive. Nathaniel nearly collapsed with relief as he wrapped the child in clean towels and placed him on Anna's chest. His hands were raw from handling hot water. His knees ached from kneeling on the hard floor, and his throat burned from the taste that still lingered. But the baby was breathing, crying, gloriously alive. The storm passed before dawn, leaving a strange crystalline stillness in its wake. The mountains stood silent beneath a sky washed clean by wind and snow, the cabin half buried in pristine drifts that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the early light. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, casting gentle golden warmth across walls that had witnessed the miracle of new life. Anna stirred as the first pale rays of sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows. Her body ached with a deep, hollow weariness, but she was alive, and something small and precious moved against her chest. She turned her head slowly and found Nathaniel in the rocking chair beside the bed, wrapped in an old quilt with little Micah sleeping peacefully in his arms. The sight stopped her breath completely. Nathaniel rocked gently, unconscious of her watching, and he was singing, not loudly or clearly, but with enough voice to carry a melody. It was an old tune, something southern and mournful that a father might hum when the house was dark and he thought no one could hear. His voice cracked with exhaustion, rough as gravel from the ordeal they had shared, but he persisted with the lullaby as if his life depended on it. Anna watched through eyes bright with unshed tears, seeing not the gruff mountain man who had reluctantly taken her in, but someone transformed by the trust of a sleeping child. The way he looked at Micah was full of wonder and terror and something too tender for words. The expression of a man who had been given an unexpected second chance at fatherhood when he noticed her watching. He stopped singing abruptly, almost embarrassed. "You should be resting," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from the night's ordeal. "I was," Anna whispered. "But then I heard music. It was beautiful." He looked away, color rising in his weathered cheeks. "Didn't mean to wake you. Just seemed like he wanted to hear something." There was a pause filled with morning light and the soft sounds of a baby dreaming. And then Anna's voice broke through the hush with words that came from somewhere deeper than gratitude. "You're more of a father than his real one ever would have." Bim. Nathaniel looked down at the sleeping child, his eyes bright with moisture he refused to let fall. "Maybe," he said after a long moment. "Or maybe I just learned what matters when it was almost too late." That afternoon, while Anna napped and recovered her strength, Nathaniel sat by the fire wrestling with something in his lap, a tangle of blue wool, coarse and stubborn, that seemed determined to resist his clumsy efforts. He muttered curses under his breath as the yarn slipped through his oversized fingers, but he persevered with the patience of a man who had learned that some things were worth doing badly rather than not at all. Hours later, he held up his creation, a small hat. So lopsided and uneven, it barely qualified as clothing, but unmistakably made with love. He placed it carefully beside the cradle he had finished the week before, a simple cedar affair that hung from the ceiling beam near the window, lined with soft wool and positioned to catch the morning light. When Anna woke to the smell of venison stew simmering on the stove, she found Micah wearing his new hat. The sight of it, crooked, oversized, and utterly ridiculous, struck her as the funniest thing she had ever seen. Laughter burst from her, sudden and full, the sound of pure joy. That had been too long absent from the mountain cabin. "What's so amusing?" Nathaniel asked, mock stern, but unable to hide his own smile. "This hat," Anna said between giggles, holding up the woeful creation. "It's absolutely terrible. It looks like it's trying to be 3 different hats at once." "Well, I never claimed to be a knitter," he replied, rubbing the back of his neck in embarrassment, "but it fits well enough." She looked at him then, really looked at his kind eyes and gentle smile, and her expression softened into something warmer than amusement. "Yes," she said simply, "it does." Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand, squeezing once in a gesture that conveyed everything words could not. In that moment, surrounded by lamplight and baby's breath and the evidence of imperfect love made manifest, the weight of grief and loneliness that had carried them both through the winter began to lift. Spring came in earnest after that, bringing with it the sounds and scents of a world reborn. The snow melted from the cabin's eaves in steady drips that marked time like a grandfather clock. Mud gathered around the porch steps, and the path to the barn turned brown and rutted with the passage of boots and hooves. High above, the peaks still wore crowns of white, but down in the valley, green things began to push through the thawed earth with stubborn determination. Anna sat on the porch in the rocking chair Nathaniel had repaired for her, wrapped in her clean shawl with Micah pressed warm against her chest. The baby slept peacefully, one tiny fist curled around her finger, the other resting against the soft wool of her dress. His breathing was steady and strong, each rise and fall of his small chest a quiet miracle. Nathaniel worked nearby, splitting wood with the steady rhythm he had maintained all winter, but his movements had grown gentler since Micah's arrival. He no longer attacked the logs with the fierce energy of a man trying to outrun his thoughts, but worked with the measured pace of someone who had found peace in simple tasks. That was when the territorial agent appeared, a man in a gray coat, who rode up the mountain trail with the self-important bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His brass badge caught the sunlight like a warning, and his pale eyes surveyed the domestic scene before him with obvious disapproval. Nathaniel set down his axe and walked slowly toward the horse and rider, his stance relaxed but ready. "Something I can help you with, mister?" "Edgar Mills, Territorial Records Department," the man replied, dismounting with careful precision. "Got word there might be some irregularities up here. Woman living without proper documentation. Child. Born out of wedlock. That sort of thing tends to cause problems if it's not handled correctly." Anna rose from the rocking chair, holding Micah close as she moved to stand beside Nathaniel. There was no fear in her posture, only quiet dignity and the calm strength of a woman who had survived worse than bureaucratic intimidation. "I ain't hiding from anything," she said clearly. "Never said you were, ma'am," Edgar replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But the law requires certain documentation for residency, especially in cases involving irregular arrangements." He looked pointedly from Anna to Nathaniel and back again. "Are you married to this man?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch like a held breath. Then Nathaniel stepped forward, his voice quiet but absolutely certain. "She's my wife in every way that matters." Edgar cocked his head skeptically. "Every way except legally, from what I can see. That could mean complications, especially with a child born under questionable circumstances." "Then I'll make it legal," Nathaniel said without hesitation. "Today, if need be." Anna looked at him in surprise, but he continued speaking, his gaze never leaving the agent's face. "You want documentation. I'll provide it. You want witnesses. I'll find them. But she's not going anywhere, and neither is the boy. This is their home now." Edgar studied them both for a long moment, taking in Anna's protective hold on the baby, Nathaniel's unwavering stance, and the quiet but unmistakable bond between them. Finally, he nodded and pulled out a small ledger. "I'll need proper marriage documentation within 2 weeks," he said, scribbling notes. "Birth certificate for the child, signed by a recognized authority. Residency affidavit from at least 2 local citizens." "You'll have everything you need," Nathaniel replied. After Edgar departed, Anna and Nathaniel stood together on the porch, watching the dust settle in the agent's wake. The mountain air was sweet with the scent of pine and melting snow, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song of spring. "You didn't have to say all that," Anna said softly. "Yes, I did," Nathaniel replied. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a simple silver ring, worn smooth by years but still solid. "This was my mother's. Had her initials inside, but I filed them away and put in something new." He turned the ring so she could see the crude engraving, "Grace found." "It's not perfect," he said, holding it toward her, "but it's true." Anna looked at the ring, at the man who offered it, at the sleeping child in her arms who had brought them together in ways neither could have predicted. Without words, she shifted Micah to one arm and extended her left hand. The ring slid onto her finger as if it had always belonged there, not shining with newness, but warm with the weight of promises kept and love discovered in the most unlikely of circumstances. 1 year later, the cabin no longer looked like a place where someone had gone to disappear. Vegetable rows pushed up from the rich mountain soil: carrots, beans, tomatoes, and herbs that filled the air with earthy sweetness. A clothesline stretched between 2 tall pines, fluttering with tiny shirts and hand-sewn diapers that dried quickly in the high-altitude sun. Micah crawled across the wooden floors with determined enthusiasm, babbling to himself as he explored every corner of his world. His laughter filled not just the rooms, but the spaces between what had been and what was possible, transforming the cabin from a refuge for the wounded into a home where love grew like wildflowers in unexpected places. Anna knelt in the garden, her apron stained with tomato juice and herb clippings, a red ribbon tied loosely in her braided hair, the same ribbon Nathaniel had left on her pillow one spring morning without explanation. She looked up as he approached, and their eyes met across the small distance between them. She smiled, and he smiled back, not cautiously or with reservation, but with the full, unguarded joy of a man who was no longer afraid of being seen. That evening, after supper and stories, and a lullaby sung slightly off-key, but with complete sincerity, they sat together on the front porch. Micah slept between them, wrapped in quilts and dreaming peacefully while the mountain evenings settled around them like a blessing. The breeze whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the promise of another peaceful night. Nathaniel ran his hand slowly over the arm of his new rocking chair oak, solid and warm, shaped entirely by his own hands over the course of many evenings. It had taken weeks to complete, every groove smoothed with care, every joint fitted, with the precision of a man who finally had reason to build something meant to last. He turned the chair slightly so Anna could see the backrest more clearly. Carved into the headrest in his careful, unpracticed script were words that had taken him hours to perfect. Home wasn't the place. It was the way you said my name. Anna leaned forward, reading the inscription in the fading light, and reached for his hand. He took it without hesitation, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of long practice. "You came here to cook," he said, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. She laughed quietly, the sound warm as honey. "But you ended up teaching me how to breathe again." Anna turned to face him more fully, her eyes bright with unshed tears of gratitude. "And you reminded me that I was never just a widow. I was always more than what had been taken from me." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky deepened from gold to rose to deep purple, watching the first stars appear above the mountain peaks. Micah stirred in his sleep, murmuring something that might have been words or might have been dreams, then settled back with a contented sigh. Nathaniel leaned down and lifted the boy gently, feeling the familiar wonder of small arms that instinctively curled around his neck. Anna rested her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of pine smoke and summer evening that had become the perfume of home. "You saved me more than you know," she whispered. He pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, tasting the sweetness of her hair and the salt of grateful tears. "I know," he whispered back, understanding finally that saving and being saved were often the same thing. They rocked together as full darkness claimed the mountain, three hearts beating in rhythm while the night closed around them like a prayer answered. Some stories do not end with gunshots or glory, but with quiet redemption found in the arms of those brave enough to stay when staying seemed impossible. Nathaniel had never asked for grace, and Anna had never expected to find peace again. But in the heart of a Colorado winter, under a roof built as much from silence as from timber, they discovered that love sometimes arrives wearing work clothes and carrying its own sorrows, asking not for perfection, but simply for the courage to begin again. In the morning, there would be chores and decisions, plans to make, and a future to build one day at a time. But tonight there was only this: the weight of a sleeping child, the warmth of a woman who had chosen to stay, and the profound quiet of hearts that had finally learned to rest. The mountain kept its eternal watch above them, and somewhere in the darkness, a night bird sang the ancient song of home coming home to itself at last.